Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It was just another morning, like any other. I had a long day ahead, meetings, emails, the usual grind. I was running late, of course, as usual. I rushed to the elevator, my footsteps quick against the polished floor of the office building's lobby. The doors opened, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 8th floor, my usual destination. The elevator hummed to life, the soft chime as it began its ascent. But something was off. Instead of the usual smooth ride, I noticed the elevator jerked slightly, almost imperceptibly, as it began to climb. My finger hovered over the button, wondering if I'd accidentally hit a different floor. But no, 8 was still lit up, the correct floor selected. I tried to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. It was probably just a minor glitch, nothing to worry about. As the elevator passed the 7th floor, the lights flickered. A small, insignificant flicker, just enough to make me glance up. I felt a slight shift in the air, a kind of weight, like the space around me had grown heavier. I looked at the display again, watching the floors tick by, and then my stomach dropped. It was on the 8th floor when the numbers blinked. The elevator didn't stop at 8. Instead, it skipped ahead, the numbers lighting up in sequence until it reached the 13th floor. A cold chill washed over me. The 13th floor. That's not right. I had been working in this building for almost 3 years, and I knew for a fact there was no 13th floor. It had been skipped in the building's design, a superstition maybe, but everyone knew that floor didn't exist. Panic began to set in. I looked at the display again, half expecting it to be some kind of glitch. But it was clear 13. It was there, plain as day. I thought about pressing the button for the 8th floor again. Maybe the system was malfunctioning, but the button was unresponsive. It was as if it had been locked in place, as if I had no control over the situation anymore. The elevator slowed, and the air in the small space thickened. The familiar hum of the machine softened, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible sound, something like static or distant whispering. I felt a wave of dizziness hit me, and I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself, but the vertigo didn't go away. I closed my eyes for a second, hoping it would pass, but when I opened them again, the doors were already starting to open. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the elevator doors. There was nothing on the other side, or at least that's how it felt. The usual hallway wasn't there, just a dimly lit, narrow corridor stretching into what seemed like an endless void. It was silent, and nervingly so. I couldn't even hear the typical buzz of office chatter that usually fills these spaces. The clatter of heels against the tile, or the murmur of conversations behind closed doors. The silence was so thick, it was suffocating. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but every instinct in my body screamed for me to stay in the elevator, to slam the button and go back to the ground floor. But I couldn't. My feet moved before I even made a decision, and suddenly I was stepping out into that hallway. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, maybe. Maybe I thought I was dreaming or in some kind of stupor. But as I stepped further into the corridor, I realized something was horribly wrong. The lighting was dim, and there was something about the walls that made them seem distant, like they were too far away, too far stretched. The air was cold, colder than it had been outside, and my breath came out in visible puffs, even though it wasn't that cold in the building. The hallway stretched on longer than it should have. There were doors, some open, others closed, but each one looked the same, indistinct, plain, and unmarked. No signs, no nameplates. Just doors leading to what? I couldn't imagine, but something told me I didn't want to find out. But I couldn't stop myself from walking forward, my shoes clicking sharply against the floor as I moved deeper into the empty hallway. I turned to look back at the elevator, but when I did, it was gone. The elevator wasn't there anymore. In fact, the whole wall where the elevator doors should have been was missing. It was just blank. A gap that seemed to lead to more darkness, more distance. My heartbeat quickened. I turned back to the hallway, unsure of what to do. Should I go back? But where would I go? And why didn't the elevator seem to be coming back? Panic set in fully now, but I took another step forward, my legs moving of their own accord. I was about to pass a door on my left when I stopped, my hand reaching out to steady myself against the frame. The door was slightly ajar, just enough that I could see the faint glow of light filtering through. My curiosity overpowered my fear, and I stepped closer. Something about it drew me in. I pushed the door open with a creak, and what I saw inside made my stomach turn. It wasn't an office. It wasn't a storage room. It wasn't anything that belonged in a building like this. It was a room that felt wrong. The walls were covered with peeling wallpaper, the floor covered with old forgotten furniture, and in the corner of the room was a single desk with a pile of yellowed papers. But it wasn't the contents of the room that unsettled me, was the feeling that the room had been waiting for me, as if it had been prepared for my arrival, like I was expected. I stepped back, heart racing, and I quickly moved away from the door. My feet carried me faster now, each step more urgent than the last. But every hallway I turned into led me deeper into the unfamiliar, more lost. I couldn't find my way back. I couldn't find any exit. It was like the building itself was changing, shifting around me. It wasn't until I reached a dead end, a wall that seemed to close off my path entirely, that I felt the first true sense of fear. I turned around to head back the way I came, but that's when I heard the sound. The soft, indistinct whispering like voices, far off but close enough to make my skin crawl. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and it sounded like my name. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The hallway behind me, the rooms to the side, everything was just shadows now. The whispers grew clearer, until it was as if 100 voices were calling out to me, calling my name over and over again, until I couldn't think straight. I turned back to the wall, desperate to find an exit, but it was just a blank expanse. Now, my chest tightened as I felt my breath catch in my throat. The 13th floor. The floor I wasn't supposed to be on. The floor I couldn't escape. And then I heard it again, the soft ding of an elevator arriving behind me. When I turned, the elevator doors opened, but the space behind them was empty. I don't know how I made it back to the ground floor. I don't remember how the elevator returned, or what happened to the hallway I'd been in. All I know is that I left the building that day, heart pounding, mind racing, and I never spoke of it to anyone. The 13th floor wasn't just a floor. It was a place where things didn't belong, where time bent in strange ways, and where I wasn't meant to be. But I'll never forget the sound of those whispers. And I can't shake the feeling that no matter how far I go, I'll never truly leave that floor behind. It was a crisp, quiet morning, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath. I was walking down my usual route to work, taking the back streets to avoid the traffic. There's something peaceful about those quiet paths, especially when the air is cool and fresh like it was that day. As I rounded a corner, my foot kicked something small and metallic, sending it tumbling a few feet ahead of me. I bent down instinctively, curious about the object. It was an old-fashioned key, the kind you'd expect to see on a grand, forgotten chest or a heavy wooden door. It had a tarnished brass finish, worn smooth from years of use or maybe age alone, I couldn't tell. The key didn't have any markings or identification, nothing that would indicate what it belonged to. It was just a key. I picked it up, brushing the dirt off of it, and slipped it into my pocket, almost absent-mindedly. I didn't think much of it at the time, except that it was odd to find something like that lying on the sidewalk in the middle of the city. But the strange thing was, the moment I touched it, I felt something shift. A subtle, barely perceptible change, as though the air around me had thickened or the light had dimmed just a little bit. I shrugged it off as a weird coincidence and continued on my way. When I got home that evening, I placed the key on the kitchen counter. The faint feeling that had lingered all day, one that felt like I was holding something important, nagged at me. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something about the key that felt different, like it belonged to a world I didn't know. But I was being silly, wasn't I? It was just a key. A random object that had fallen out of someone's pocket, or maybe had been lost by a neighbor. But the next morning, the feeling returned. It was almost as if the key had drawn me to it. My hand reached out for it before I even realized what I was doing. The same strange tugging sensation in my chest. I turned it over in my fingers, examining it again. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a faint, almost imperceptible symbol etched into the side of the key. A symbol I couldn't recognize. It was small, so small I hadn't noticed it the first time I picked it up. I could feel my curiosity grow, an uncomfortable sense that I was about to embark on something I didn't fully understand. That night, as I was winding down for bed, I saw something out of the corner of my Aja door. Not the one I knew so well, the one that led to my bedroom, but another door, standing in the middle of the living room. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the window. But when I looked again, the door was still there, standing quietly against the far wall. It was a simple wooden door, with a brass doorknob that looked just like the one I'd found on the key. My heart began to race, my breath shallow. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired, and maybe the stress of work was getting to me. I turned away, focusing on something else, but the door was still there, waiting. I had to know. What was behind that door? Why had it appeared now, and why did the key feel so right? I walked over to the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. I could hear the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I reached for the knob, my hand trembling slightly, as if I was about to open something I wasn't supposed to. The key from my pocket seemed to grow warmer in my hand, and I could feel that familiar tugging sensation in my chest again. I turned the key in the door. It fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there, in that lock. With a soft click, the door swung open, and I was met with a thick darkness. There was nothing there, not a room, not a hallway, just an empty void. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence press against my skin. I stepped forward, the darkness pulling at me like a magnet, but when I crossed the threshold, something changed. The world outside the familiar walls of my living room disappeared. The door shut behind me with a soft thud, leaving me in absolute blackness. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, and I felt a deep sense of unease that gripped my entire body. It was the kind of darkness that felt oppressive, like it was closing in on me from all sides. I reached out, my fingertips brushing against something cold and rough, but I couldn't make out what it was. I tried to call out, but my voice came out strangled, swallowed by the stillness around me. I turned back toward the door, desperate to find my way back to the light, but when I touched the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was as though the door had become part of the wall, sealed shut from the other side. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the unknown pressing against me, but eventually, my eyes began to adjust, or maybe my mind was starting to make sense of the impossible. I could see shapes now, faint outlines in the darkness. There were walls, yes, but they were unfamiliar, like they had been built in a place that didn't make sense. The air was thick with dust, and the ground beneath me felt uneven, like the floor was shifting. I started to walk, unsure of where I was going, the key still in my hand. The walls around me seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and with each step, the space seemed to change, narrowing, expanding, turning into something altogether unfamiliar. I was no longer sure if I was in my house, in some forgotten hallway, or somewhere entirely different. And then I saw it. A light, faint at first, flickering in the distance. It beckoned me, pulling me forward. I moved toward it, my heart hammering in my chest, desperate for something familiar, something solid. As I walked, the light grew stronger, clearer. It wasn't the soft glow of a lamp or the warmth of the sunlight I knew. It was a harsh, cold light, one that didn't belong in the place I had just walked into. When I reached it, I stood in front of a mirror, but it wasn't my reflection staring back at me. It was a reflection of a room that was not mine, but one that was eerily similar. It was a reflection of a house, a place I had never been, but that felt like home in a way I couldn't explain. I looked down at the key in my hand, realizing that it hadn't just opened a door. It had opened something else entirely. It had opened a door to nowhere, to a place that didn't exist in any world I knew. And as I stared at the mirror, I felt the strangest sensation that I was no longer looking at the world outside the door. I was looking into a world where I had never belonged, and yet, a world that now felt like it was waiting for me to step in. I had found a key, yes, but it was a key to something far more unsettling than I could have ever imagined. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the reflection of a place that didn't belong to me. But I do know this: I don't think I'll ever truly leave. Because once the door has opened, once you step through, you don't always find your way back. It was one of those warm, lazy afternoons when everything feels like it's moving in slow motion. The kind of day where time seems to stretch out, like the sunlight itself is sluggishly stretching across the pavement, and the air feels thick and comfortable. I had just finished running a few errands and was walking back home, enjoying the gentle breeze on my face. The neighborhood was peaceful, with only the distant hum of cars and the occasional dog barking in the distance. I turned onto the street where I lived, a quiet road lined with old trees whose branches swayed gently in the wind. My house was just a few doors down, a familiar place I'd spent countless days in. But that day, something was different, something I couldn't quite place. It started when I saw her. She was standing by the old oak tree, the one that had been there longer than I could remember. It wasn't unusual for people to be outside, especially on such a beautiful day, but there was something oddly familiar about her. Her figure was outlined in the soft, golden light of the afternoon, and her hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, just the way I always remembered. But what struck me most was her expression, gentle, almost nostalgic. She was looking right at me. At first, I thought she was just another neighbor, someone I hadn't seen in a while. But then, as I drew closer, a wave of recognition hit me, and my stomach dropped. It was her. I hadn't seen her in years, not since she left without a word, disappearing from my life as if she had never been there at all. The thought of her had lingered with me, in the quiet moments when I thought about things left unsaid, about all the questions that remained unanswered. But here she was, standing under the oak tree, looking as though no time had passed at all. The familiar mix of disbelief and hope bubbled up in my chest, and I quickened my pace. "Hey," I called out to her, my voice unsteady, almost afraid to break the silence between us. I wanted to run to her, but my legs felt heavy, as though moving toward her would somehow make the moment more real, more fragile. She smiled at me, and that smile, the same one I had once known so well, sent a chill through my spine. She didn't speak at first, just smiled and nodded as if everything were normal, as though she hadn't vanished from my life without a trace. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Where have you been? What happened? I finally blurted out, my words tumbling over each other in a rush of confusion and longing. I wasn't sure if I wanted an explanation or if I was just hoping to see her again, to fill the void she had left. She looked at me for a long moment, and her gaze softened, almost with sorrow. Then, without a word, she slowly lifted her hand and waved. It wasn't a casual wave, as if she was just saying goodbye to a passing friend. It was a deliberate, final motion. A wave that felt loaded with meaning, as if it were the end of something, the closure I never thought I would get. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Was she really leaving again? Was this all there was to it? A brief meeting, a wave, and then nothing. She waved again, a slow motion that seemed to stretch, as though the seconds themselves were hanging in the air. I could feel the weight of everything unsaid between us, all the things I wanted to ask, all the things I didn't understand. But before I could say anything else, before I could even take another step forward, I blinked. And just like that, she was gone. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes scanned the street, the old oak tree where she had been standing only moments ago, but there was nothing. No sign of her. No trace that she had been there at all. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I turned around, looking over my shoulder in a frantic search for any hint of where she had gone. I felt the world around me shift, the quiet hum of the street now suddenly deafening, like the air itself had become thick and impossible to breathe. The light seemed to dim, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I walked to the spot where she had been standing, my footsteps hesitant, as if I were afraid to disturb the fragile memory of what had just happened. The grass under the tree was undisturbed, not a single footprint to mark her presence. I stood there for a long time, trying to piece together what had just occurred. My mind was racing. Was I imagining things? Had I simply seen a mirage of some kind, a trick of the light? But that smile, the way she waved, it felt too real. The more I stood there, the more I realized how much I wanted to believe it had happened. How much I needed it to be real. I had spent so many years wondering what happened to her, if she was okay, why she had left. And now, here she was, offering me nothing but a smile and a wave. But where had she gone? Why had she disappeared again? I eventually left, though I wasn't sure what I was leaving behind or what I had found. All I knew was that, in that brief moment, I had seen something from my past, a fleeting glimpse of someone I thought I had lost forever. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the entire encounter had been a dream, a moment suspended in time. I checked my phone, the time, anything to ground me back in reality. But nothing seemed to make sense. The next day, I returned to the spot where I had seen her, hoping against logic that somehow, some way, she might be there again. But there was nothing. The street was empty, just as it had always been. The oak tree stood tall and unmoved, the same as it had been for years. I thought about the wave she gave me, the goodbye she seemed to be offering. I still don't know if she was truly there, or if I had imagined it all, but the thought of it lingers with me. The image of her, standing there with that bittersweet smile, is something I can't seem to shake. And every time I walk past that tree, I wonder if she be there again. If, somehow, I'll catch a glimpse of her, just for a moment. But when I turn around, I always find the same emptiness, the same quiet street. She waved goodbye, but when I turned around, she was gone. And now, I'm left with only the feeling that she never truly left, or that she never really came back at all. I've always been drawn to abandoned places, the kind that hold secrets and stories locked within their walls. So when I heard about the old tunnel beneath the city, something whispered about in hushed tones and hidden from the usual tourist maps, I couldn't resist. People talked about it like it was some forgotten relic, a hidden passageway from a time long past. Some said it led nowhere. Others claimed it was just a part of the city's forgotten history, built during a different era and left to rot. But the mystery of it called to me, so I decided to see for myself. I found the entrance one rainy afternoon. It was tucked away behind a crumbling wall near an old, deserted alley. You wouldn't even know it was there unless you were looking for Etor, if you had heard the same stories I had. The iron door was rusted, its hinges long since gone, but the tunnel itself was wide enough for me to slip inside. The air felt different as soon as I stepped in, cooler, heavier with the scent of earth and damp stone. The sound of traffic faded away immediately, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the tunnel. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, a little uneasy now that I was standing in the darkness, but curiosity kept me going. The tunnel stretched before me, lit only by the dim light filtering through cracks in the brickwork. I took my first few steps cautiously, the faint echo of my footsteps reminding me just how isolated I was. The walls were covered in layers of grime and decay, old graffiti here and there, the remnants of people who had passed through before me. I wondered how long it had been since anyone had walked this path, how many years, decades even, had gone by since this tunnel was a part of something more than just a forgotten space beneath the city. I didn't know how far the tunnel stretched, but something told me it wasn't just a simple, straight path. I was beginning to feel like I was being led somewhere. Every turn I took seemed to open into another, and each turn felt like it was drawing me deeper into the earth, further away from the world I knew. I thought I might turn back at one point, but then I saw a faint light ahead, the kind that beckons you to keep going, and I found myself pushing forward once more. The tunnel eventually began to widen, and the oppressive silence began to lift, replaced by a strange hum, a low vibration that seemed to pulse in the air around me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the hum of the city above somehow seeping through the walls. But it grew louder, a distant, almost mechanical sound. It felt out of place and natural in a way that I couldn't quite explain. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel something I hadn't expected. The further I went, the more my surroundings seemed to shift, subtly at first. The bricks on the walls seemed older, worn by time, and the tunnel's shape began to change. The straight lines became curves, the ceiling lower in some places, higher in others. I could feel the temperature drop too, the air growing thicker, heavier, as though I were moving through something that wasn't quite the same world anymore. But still, I walked on. Then I came to a door. It was unlike any door I had ever seen in the city, a heavy, wooden thing, with intricate carvings along the edges, dark with age. There was no doorknob, no obvious way to open it, but it beckoned me, as if calling me to step through. I stood there for a long time, my hand hovering just inches away from the surface, wondering if I should turn back or continue. Something inside me whispered that I should open it, and so I did. The door creaked open slowly, the sound of its hinges screeching through the silence, and what lay on the other side made my heart stop. It wasn't the tunnel I had entered. It wasn't even the same city. I stepped through the doorway, and suddenly I was standing on a bustling street, surrounded by buildings I didn't recognize. The air smelled different, fresher, but also foreign. The architecture was strange, older in some places, newer in others, like a city caught between eras. The sky above was a dull gray, and I could hear the faint murmur of voices in the distance. But everything felt wrong. It wasn't just the difference in the city. It was the fact that I had never seen any of it before. Not the streets, not the shops, not even the people who passed by, none of them familiar. I turned around to look back at the tunnel, the door, but it was gone. There was nothing behind me except an ordinary street corner. My mind raced. Had I stumbled into some parallel world? A forgotten part of the city, hidden from the rest of the world? Or had the tunnel, somehow, shifted me into a place that wasn't supposed to exist? I couldn't wrap my head around it. There was no way I had walked into another dimension, yet that's how it felt. The city was different, the sounds were different, the very air felt different. And the most unsettling part was that no one seemed to notice me. People walked past, their faces blurred, their movements mechanical and distant, like they were unaware of my presence. I started walking down the street, my steps slow, deliberate. I tried to take in every detail, the way the buildings stood, their architecture more like something out of a bygone era, not a modern city. The old-fashioned street lamps flickered dimly, casting a pale light on the cobblestone streets. I felt out of place, like an intruder in a world I didn't belong to. I tried to ask someone for directions, but the person I approached simply walked through me, as if I wasn't even there. The sensation of their gaze passing right through me made my skin crawl. I reached out to touch someone, desperate for any sign of reality, but my hand passed through them, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. What was happening? I walked faster now, feeling the panic rising in my chest. I had to get out of here. I had to find a way back. But no matter how far I walked, the city seemed to stretch on, an endless labyrinth of unfamiliar streets and alleyways. Every corner I turned, the buildings looked even more foreign, the air heavier, more oppressive. It was as if I was walking through a dream, no, worse, a nightmare. The more I walked, the more disconnected I felt from everything around me. The city had a rhythm, a life of its own, but it didn't care about me. I was just another ghost passing through, a shadow in a place that wasn't meant for me. Eventually, I found a narrow alleyway that seemed to lead back to a quieter part of the city. I entered it, hoping to find some semblance of direction. But there was nothing, just walls, more buildings, the feeling of being trapped. And then, just as I was about to lose hope, I saw a door, faintly glowing in the distance. It wasn't the same one I had passed through earlier, but it felt familiar, almost like it was calling me. I walked towards it, cautiously now, and when I reached it, I opened it without hesitation. But when I stepped through, I was back in my own city, standing in the alley where I had first found the tunnel. The streetlights flickered overhead, the sounds of the city returning to their normal rhythm. I'm back, I thought, relieved. It was over. But when I looked around, I realized something. The city was the same, but I wasn't. The world had shifted while I wasn't paying attention. And now, everything felt different, unfamiliar. It was as if I had brought something back with me. I'm still here, still trying to make sense of it. But every time I walk down the street, I can't shake the feeling that the city I came back to is not the same one I left. I don't know what happened in that tunnel, or where I truly went. But the more I think about it, the more I'm not sure I ever left. And I wonder if I walked through another door, would I find myself in a new world again? Or have I already stepped into a place where I no longer belong? I've always been a creature of habit. I take the bus every morning, the same route, the same time, and it's always been a comforting rhythm in my life. There's something about the predictability of it, the familiar faces, the constant hum of the engine, the slow pace of the morning commute that helps ground me. I never really thought much about the details. The bus was just a way to get from point A to point B that morning, though something felt off from the moment I stepped onto the bus. It wasn't the weather though. It was unusually gray for a summer date. Wasn't the usual hustle and bustle of commuters crowding the aisle. No, it was something subtler. As I boarded, I noticed the bus was quieter than usual. Almost too quiet. The driver gave me a nod but didn't say anything. I took my seat, glancing around at the empty rows. The bus was almost entirely deserted, which was strange for this time of morning. There was usually at least a few people, some half asleep or reading newspapers. But today, the seats were empty. I chalked it up to the weather. Maybe people decided to take a later bus. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling, trying to occupy myself as we made our way down the usual streets. But as the bus rolled along, something began to feel wrong. The further we went, the emptier it felt. The streets outside seemed more desolate than usual. The usual shops and buildings looked different, like they'd been frozen in time. There was no one walking along the sidewalk, no cars driving past. Just empty roads stretching into nothingness. I looked up from my phone. The city I knew so well was slipping away, replaced by unfamiliar sights. We passed a row of buildings I was certain I hadn't seen before. The bus seemed to move more slowly now, as though the engine itself was struggling, yet the driver showed no sign of noticing. His eyes remained fixed on the road, expressionless, like he was lost in thought. I should have gotten off then. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I sat there, paralyzed by the growing discomfort in my chest, watching as the bus continued on its way, its tires squealing softly on the damp road. I couldn't bring myself to speak to the driver or ask what was going on, partly because I couldn't explain what I was feeling, and partly because, for the first time in my life, I was scared. The bus eventually stopped at a station, but this stationette wasn't like any station I'd seen before. It wasn't on any route I recognized. The sign was old and faded, barely legible. The platform was empty, not a single soul in sight. The light posts flickered as if they were struggling to stay on. The bus doors hissed open, and I stood up, hesitantly, not knowing what to do. The driver didn't move. He didn't even look at me. I stepped off the bus, my shoes tapping lightly on the worn concrete as I took my first step into the station. The place had a feeling of abandonment, like it hadn't been used in years. The benches were dusty, the walls cracked and peeling, and the air smelled musty, like forgotten places. I could hear my breathing, slow and shallow, and it felt as if the silence was swallowing everything. I turned around to look at the bus. It was still there, but the doors were now closed. The driver was still sitting behind the wheel, motionless, his hands on the steering wheel, but his face hidden in the shadows of the bus. I could only see his outline, the occasional flicker of movement as he turned his head. For some reason, the fact that the bus was still waiting unnerved me more than anything. It felt wrong. like it was waiting for me to make a decision, like I was supposed to do something, but I didn't know what. The station was still empty. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed off the walls, but no one responded. Not even a distant sound of movement. I walked a little further down the platform, my footsteps echoing louder than I expected, the stillness pressing in around me like a thick fog. I checked my watch. The time was the same, but something about it felt wrong. I felt like I had lost all sense of time since I boarded the bus. It had only been a few minutes, hadn't it? But here I was, standing in a place that didn't exist. It didn't make sense. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air around me seemed to grow colder, heavier. I turned back to the bus and then froze. The driver was no longer behind the wheel. The seat was empty, just like the rest of the bus. The panic started creeping up my throat. The station felt unreal, like I was the only person who existed in this strange, empty world. My pulse quickened, and I turned to the exit of the station, but there was no door, no sign of how I could leave. The platform stretched out into an endless void, and I felt like I had wandered into some liminal space caught between places, between worlds. I started to back away slowly, then turned and ran back to the bus, my feet pounding on the cracked concrete. I needed to get out. I needed to go back to where I came from. But when I reached the bus, I stopped short. It was gone. The bus had vanished. Just like that. One moment it was there, and the next it had disappeared into thin air. The station was completely empty now, and the stillness around me seemed to close in on all sides. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't figure out how I had gotten there, or where the bus had gone. I had followed the bus to a station, but now the station was empty. The world had shifted, and I was left standing in the middle of it, completely alone. I walked back to the platform, heart racing, still expecting the bus to return. But there was no sign of it. Only the silence. Only the stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly, as though I were waiting for something that would never come. And now, every time I get on a bus, I wonder, what happened to that bus? Why was I the only one on it? Where did it take me? And, more importantly, where will I end up next time? But most of all, I wonder if I'll ever find my way back to the place I thought I knew. I've always had an inclination for exploration, the kind that goes beyond the touristy spots and into the heart of unknown places. So, when I found an old map tucked away in a second-hand bookshop, it piqued my curiosity. The map was tattered, yellowed with age, and seemed to depict a small, rural part of the countryside I'd never seen before. There were roads marked that weren't on any modern maps, and places named with a kind of charm that didn't seem to belong to the present day. But what truly caught my attention was a small, dotted line that led to a spot marked with a large red X. There was something enticing about it, like a promise of discovery, of finding something hidden away, forgotten by time. I couldn't resist. I decided to follow the map, convinced it would lead me to something unique, perhaps an old ruin, a forgotten building, or maybe even something more interesting. The drive out was uneventful. the kind of journey that starts with excitement and fades into a hum of routine. The roads were quiet, with very little traffic. The scenery around me grew wilder as I left the town behind, the trees thickening and the fields stretching out on either side. I was following the roads exactly as the map described them, one turn after another, each more remote than the last. I began to wonder, as I went further and further, if I was being foolish. The map didn't have any street names, no distances, nothing that made much sense in the modern world. It was just roads, trails, and markings, many of them faded, almost as if they weren't meant to be found. But I pushed those thoughts aside. After all, every great discovery starts with uncertainty, right? The last turn I made was down a narrow, winding road that was barely more than a dirt path. Trees loomed overhead, their branches thick and intertwining, casting long shadows across the road. There was something eerie about it. The air felt heavy, and the further I went, the quieter it got. The sound of birds and the wind in the trees was almost deafening in its stillness, and the world around me seemed to grow smaller, as if the trees were closing in on the road. But still, I kept going. The map had me go deeper into the woods, and the road gradually became less defined. It was as though the path was being erased with each passing moment. My car bounced over rocks and uneven ground, the tires struggling to grip the dirt. I could see nothing but the trees, thick and dark, surrounding me. The road had begun to fade out of existence. I pulled over to the side of the road, stepping out of the car to get a better look at the map. It was getting harder to follow the markings, as the roads on the map no longer aligned with what I was seeing. My heart skipped a beat as I looked down at the spot where the dotted line should have led me. There was nothing. The map indicated I should be nearing the red X, but the road had simply vanished. The trees were thick in front of me, a solid wall of green. I walked around, looking for any sign of a path or trail, but there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the wind, the rustling of leaves, and the growing sense that I was far from anywhere I had known. I thought about turning back. It was foolish to keep going, I knew that. But there was something about the mystery, something compelling me forward. I told myself that maybe the road just wasn't visible anymore, that maybe it had been overgrown, and that I just needed to push through a little further. I started walking, pushing through the underbrush. The ground was soft underfoot, the air thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to grow denser. The sky above grew darker, the sun's light unable to penetrate the thick canopy. It felt as if I was entering another world, one where time itself had stopped. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape never changed. The trees were constant, the air still, and the path, or what was left of it, seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The more I walked, the more I felt that sense of unease creeping over me. It was as if the world itself had shifted, and I had somehow slipped into a place that didn't belong to me. I kept looking back, half expecting to see the road I had driven down. But each time I turned around, the way I came had vanished. The trees were too thick, the ground too uneven for me to even retrace my steps. I checked the map again. The X was there, clearly marked, but the road leading to it had dissolved into nothing. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Was this some sort of illusion? Had I gotten lost? But the map was so clear, so deliberate in its markings. It couldn't have been wrong, could it? And then, just as I was about to turn back and accept that the map had led me astray, I noticed something in the distance. There, through the trees, was a clearing. It was small, but it looked different, almost unnatural in its symmetry. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The clearing was open, like a space carved out by something deliberate. But what stood at the center of it made my breath catch in my throat. It was an old stone, well worn with age, its edges overgrown with ivy and moss. It didn't belong here, in the middle of nowhere. It was too perfect, too deliberate in its placement. And as I walked closer, I felt the weight of the air grow even thicker. The trees, the woods, the entire forest seemed to lean in closer, as if watching me. I approached the well, peering inside. But instead of the usual darkness you expect from a well, I saw something else alight, faint but visible, as if something was glowing from deep within the stone structure. My heart raced. I leaned over, trying to get a better look, when I heard a noise behind me. I froze. The sound was distant at first, footsteps, moving through the leaves. They were slow, deliberate, and the closer they got, the more the air seemed to press in on me. I turned around, expecting to see someone who might explain what was happening. Someone who had been following the path, just like me. But there was nothing. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and I stood there in silence, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. The map had led me here, to this well, to this clearing, but it had led me to something else, to something I couldn't explain. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring into the darkness of the well, the footsteps echoing in my mind. But when I finally turned around to leave, I realized something strange. The path I had walked had vanished. The trees had closed in, the ground had shifted, and the clearing was no longer there. I was standing in the middle of an impenetrable forest, no sign of where I had come from. The map was still in my hand, but the road was gone. It had vanished, just like everything else. I had just checked into the hotel, a small boutique place nestled on the quieter end of the city. It wasn't a luxury hotel, more of a modest, understated kind of place, but it had an old-world charm to it, with dark wood furniture and soft lighting. I had been traveling for hours, and exhaustion was weighing heavily on me. I was eager to settle into my room, stretch out, and forget about the long day. The receptionist was friendly enough, but she had a distracted air about her, as though her mind was elsewhere. She handed me the key card without much of a greeting and directed me toward the elevators. The hallways were quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the lights above. When I reached my floor, I found my room at the end of a narrow corridor. The door was already ajar, which struck me as odd for a hotel where security was usually a top priority. I thought nothing of it at the time. Perhaps the cleaning staff had left it open for ventilation. I pushed the door further open and stepped inside, but as I did, something caught my attention. The room wasn't empty. There, standing by the window, was a woman. She had her back to me, her silhouette outlined against the soft light coming from outside. She didn't seem to notice my presence at first, which was odd. I cleared my throat, hoping to make my presence known, but the woman didn't flinch. She just stood there, motionless, staring out into the distance. For a moment, I thought maybe she was someone from the hotel staff, perhaps the manager, or another guest who had checked in before me. But as I stood there, waiting for some acknowledgement, I began to feel a subtle unease. The longer I stared at her, the more I noticed that something about the whole situation felt wrong. The room seemed too still, too quiet. I glanced around quickly, expecting to see some indication that she was just passing through. But the bed was unmade, the desk untouched, as if the room had been lived in, but not by anyone who had checked in recently. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the air had been thickened by the presence of someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The faint smell of perfume lingered, but it wasn't the kind of scent you would expect from a hotel guest. It was more personal, like something that had clung to the room for a long time. I spoke up again, this time more clearly. "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake. This is my room." The woman didn't react. She didn't even turn around. I took a cautious step forward, feeling a sense of confusion mixed with unease. "I'm sorry, but I've been assigned this room." The key card, I pulled it from my pocket, holding it up to show her. "It's my room." Still nothing. No acknowledgement. Just her standing there, unmoving, as if lost in thought. My heart began to race. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't normal. The key card, the quiet, the way she hadn't responded it, was all wrong. I thought about leaving, about going back to the front desk to ask for another room, but I felt rooted to the spot, almost paralyzed by a strange mixture of fear and confusion. "Excuse me," I said again, this time with more force. "You're in the wrong room." Finally, she moved. But instead of turning around or acknowledging me, she simply stepped to the side, slowly, methodically, as though she hadn't heard a word I said, as though she were following a pattern or routine. Her face remained hidden, her back still to me. A surge of frustration rose within me. I was beyond uncomfortable now, my skin crawling. This wasn't right. I had been traveling for hours, and now I was standing in this strange room with a woman who seemed to be doing her best to ignore me. I moved forward cautiously, stepping around her to see her face, hoping to finally make eye contact, hoping to break through whatever strange trance she seemed to be in. When I did finally see her face, my heart stopped. It wasn't a woman I recognized. It wasn't a woman at all, not in the way I expected. The face was there, but it was wrong. Her features were distorted, like a half-remembered dream, shifting just slightly every time I tried to focus on them. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally so, and her mouth was set in a thin, unnatural line, as if she were forcing herself to remain expressionless. Her skin was pale, too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. And then there was something about her gaze, something hollow, empty. It was then that I realized she wasn't breathing, at least, not in the way a person should. Her chest didn't rise and fall. No subtle sound of air moving through her lungs. She wasn't alive, not in any real sense of the word. But somehow, she was still standing there, in front of me. I felt the panic rise again, stronger now. My legs felt weak, my body urging me to turn around and run. I backed away, almost tripping over the chair behind me, my eyes never leaving her face. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. She stepped aside fully, revealing the empty bed behind her. The sheets were turned down, a suitcase sitting next to the dresser, as if someone had just left the room. But she didn't move. She didn't follow me. She was gone. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what I had just witnessed. The room felt cold now, colder than it should have. I looked back at the door, half expecting her to appear again, but there was nothing. The hallway outside was quiet, still. I left the room as quickly as I could, rushing back to the elevator and down to the lobby. I approached the desk and explained the situation to the receptionist, my voice shaky. She blinked, confused, then checked her system. "There must be some mistake," she said, looking back up at me. "There's no record of anyone else being assigned that room." My heart sank. "But there was someone in there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me again, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" I nodded, but the words felt hollow. She smiled, a thin, almost pitying smile. "It's just you in that room, sir. There's no one else." I didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't possible. I had seen her. I had heard her, felt the presence of her, had seen the way she stood there, motionless and distant. But now, when I returned to my room to check, there was nothing. The bed was undisturbed. The room was empty, exactly as it should have been. And yet, the feeling lingered. The chill in the air. The sense that something wasn't right. I never saw her again. But I still wonder, every time I check into a hotel room, what happened in that room that night. Was she ever really there? Or had I stepped into a place where something else was occupying space, something that didn't belong? I don't know. But every time I enter a new room, I wonder just for a moment if I'll find her waiting there again. It started like any other evening. The kind where the world outside my window feels distant, almost like a movie playing in the background of my life. I had just gotten home after a long day at work, nothing particularly eventful, just the usual routine. The sky was overcast, and the air had that cold bite to it, typical of a late autumn evening. I'd been living in this apartment for almost a year now, in a part of the city that, at first, seemed vibrant but had slowly become quieter over time. I loved the view from my window. It looked out over the city, the skyline stretching far into the distance. On clear days, I could see the faint outline of the hills beyond the buildings. But even on the gray days, the city felt alive. The lights twinkled as night fell, the movement of cars below seemed endless, and the sounds of the street filtered in faintly through the glass. That night, though, something was different. I walked over to the window, intending to just look outside for a moment, as I often did when I needed a mental break from the mundanity of the day. But as I gazed out, something wasn't right. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was as if the city had been swallowed by the fog, thick and impenetrable. The buildings, the streets, the familiar lights, all shrouded in a gray void. The city felt empty, silent. I strained my eyes, searching for any trace of life, any sign of the streets I knew so well, but there was nothing. I pressed my palm to the cold glass of the window, trying to focus. But the more I stared, the more unnerving it became. The usual outline of the skyscrapers, the cars moving along the street, none of it was there. Instead, I saw only a vast, empty nothingness. The skyline had disappeared. The buildings that had once defined my view simply vanished. It was as if the city, my city, had been erased in an instant, leaving behind a flat, desolate expanse. I pulled back from the window, my heart beginning to race. I must have been mistaken, I thought. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, some strange reflection caused by the setting sun or an odd shift in the weather. But when I stepped closer again, the void was still there. No city, no buildings, nothing. I could feel my pulse quicken. The silence outside was suffocating, a heavy stillness that pressed against the window like it was holding its breath. I turned around, almost as if seeking reassurance from the walls of my apartment. The furniture that still looked the same, the clock ticking on the wall. But my gaze kept drifting back to the window, unwilling to let me forget what I had seen. I stepped back, my fingers trembling as I reached for my phone. I checked the time. It was still evening, the usual hour for the city to be alive with activity. The streets should have been bustling with people heading home from work, the distant sound of traffic. Yet there was nothing. I couldn't hear the hum of the city. It was as if the life of the world had been drained away. I opened the curtains fully now, stepping back to get a better look, my mind racing to rationalize what was happening. But nothing changed. I walked to the front door and peered out into the hallway, half expecting to find something amiss there too, but everything was as it should be. The soft buzz of the apartment building's lights flickered above me. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, moving toward the elevator. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like I needed to get outside, to somehow confirm that I hadn't just imagined it. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and I stepped inside. I could feel the weight of the air, thick with something I couldn't name. I pressed the button for the ground floor, but as the elevator descended, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The usual hum of the machinery sounded far too loud in the silence. When the doors opened, I expected to see the familiar lobby, the entrance to the building I had lived in for so long. But instead, I was met with an empty, darkened hallway. The lobby lights were off, and the door that should have led to the street was simply gone. There was no door. Just a blank wall where the entrance had always been. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away, my heart thudding in my chest, feeling the walls close in around me. This wasn't normal. This couldn't be happening. The elevator doors closed on their own, and I found myself back in my apartment moments later, still feeling the oppressive silence weighing down on me. I stumbled to the window once more, almost desperate now. I had to see something, anything outside, but the view was unchanged. The city still wasn't there. No distant buildings. No glowing streetlights. No moving cars or bustling pedestrians. It was as if it had never existed at all, swallowed up in a vast, empty void. I sank down onto the floor, my mind whirling, trying to make sense of what was happening. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to steady my breathing, to calm myself. But when I looked up again, something else caught my attention. There, in the empty space where the city should have been, there was a faint shape of figure, standing in the distance, barely visible through the fog. It was hard to tell if it was real or just a trick of the light, but I could have sworn it was a person, standing still, unmoving. I watched it for a long time, not sure what to do. The figure didn't seem to change, but its presence filled the space in a way that made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, unnatural, as though it had no place in this strange, empty world. I turned away from the window, unsure of what to do next. What was I supposed to do now? How could I explain any of this? I felt trapped, like I had stepped into a place that wasn't real. A place that had no connection to the world I had known. The silence was unbearable. The city was gone, and with it, everything I knew. And yet, I was still here, as though I had been left behind, forgotten. And I have no answers. I don't know how long I've been here, or how to get back. The city, the life I once knew, it's all just a memory now. A memory I can barely hold on to. But every time I look out the window, I wonder what happened to the city? What happened to me? The silence never ends. I don't know how long I had been standing there. Time felt strange that day, like it had slipped through my fingers and become something I couldn't hold on to. I had been walking around the neighborhood, trying to familiarize myself with the area. I had just moved to this part of town, and while I liked it, there was something unsettling about it. The houses all looked similar, but not in a comforting way, more like they were copies of each other, replicated and stacked along the street without any real individuality. The weather was calm, cloudy, but not gloomy. The air was crisp, with a faint smell of rain from earlier in the day. I had made a mental note to find a good cafe nearby and was searching for something familiar, when I found myself standing at the corner of two streets. The intersection of Elmwood and Birch. It should have been a normal street corner. And yet, it felt wrong. Not immediately, but there was a subtle sense of disconnection that I couldn't ignore. The buildings felt farther away than they should have been, and the streetlights looked strange, just a little too bright for that time of day. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the new neighborhood getting to me. Maybe I had been walking in circles. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath and started to cross the street. But something made me stop. I had already crossed halfway when I noticed the street signs again. Something about them felt wrong, like they had shifted in my peripheral vision. I looked up, expecting to see the familiar Elmwood and Birch signs, but instead, I saw Maple and Pine. I froze. No, that wasn't right. I had definitely been on Elmwood and Birch just a moment ago. I hadn't crossed anything. I couldn't have. I had been standing at the corner, hadn't I? I looked around, and nothing seemed to have changed. The buildings were still in place, the traffic was still flowing as usual, the same people were walking past. Yet the street signs, they didn't belong. Maple and Pine didn't even feel familiar, not in the way I expected them to. They felt foreign, alien. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the disorienting haze in my mind. I took a few steps back, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was exhausted from the move and my mind was playing games with me. I crossed back to the other side, back to where I had been standing before. And then it happened again. The signs had changed once more. This time, the names were different. Oak and cedar. I blinked rapidly, a cold chill crawling up my arms. I was certain I had been standing at the same corner, yet the names on the signs weren't the ones I had seen just moments before. Panic started to rise in my chest. I wasn't imagining if this was happening. I looked around, but there was no one nearby who seemed to notice. The world around me continued as if nothing had changed. I could hear a car passing, the sound of footsteps, but nothing felt real anymore. I checked my phone, as if I could rely on something concrete. The time was normal. The weather app showed the same forecast, but nothing explained the disorienting shift I was feeling. My thoughts scrambled to make sense of it. What if I wasn't standing at the same corner anymore? What if this wasn't the same street? But how could that be? I could see the buildings I had passed earlier, the same faces in the crowd, the same stores. And yet, every time I looked back at the street signs, they had changed again. Birch and elmwood. Maple and pine. Oak and cedar. Each combination felt more distant, more unfamiliar. I took another step forward, trying to distance myself from the growing panic, telling myself I just needed to keep walking, to get some distance from the strange disorientation that was taking hold of me. But then something caught my eye. The people. They weren't just walking past anymore. They were standing still, frozen in time. Their faces were blank, eyes staring straight ahead, as though they were waiting for something to happen. They weren't moving, not a single muscle twitching. But when I looked back at them, their positions had changed just slightly, a fraction of an inch. But it was enough to make my stomach tighten, enough to make me question everything. It wasn't possible. These people were real, weren't they? I turned around again, trying to find something to ground me. Maybe there was something wrong with the street, or the signs had been tampered with. But the street had shifted asterisk, almost like it had been reset. The buildings hadn't moved, but the feeling was different, and I couldn't ignore it. I turned back to the corner where I had been standing for what felt like an eternity, and once again, the signs were different. But this time, they didn't read as maple and pine or oak and cedar. They were just blank, as if the street itself had been erased from existence. I reached out toward the blank signs, trying to touch them, but as my hand neared, they faded away completely. The street, the buildings, the very corner where I had been standing gone. All that was left was a strange, blank expanse of nothingness, a vast emptiness that stretched on infinitely. The buildings, the traffic, the people, they had disappeared, as if they had never existed at all. I took a few shaky steps back, my heart racing, the air thick with the silence of this empty space. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The world felt like it was unspooling around me, like I was standing in some kind of limbo. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been minutes, hours, or even longer. Eventually, I turned around and started walking aimlessly, as if there was some hope that I could find the street again, find something familiar. But as I moved, the street kept changing, the signs kept shifting, and the feeling of disconnection grew stronger with each step. I haven't found that corner since. Sometimes, when I close my eyes and think about it, I wonder if it was all just a dream, a trick my mind played on me. But the more I think about it, the more I feel like it was real, too real. The streets don't feel the same anymore. Every corner feels like it's shifting beneath me, like I'm standing on the edge of something that isn't meant for me. And now, whenever I walk, I find myself pausing at every street sign, waiting for it to change, to slip away from me again. But it never does. It stays the same, and I can't help but wonder. Asterisk, is it me that's changed, or is it the street? I had just moved to a new part of the city. The streets were unfamiliar, the sounds of the traffic different, and even the air felt new, cooler in some places, warmer in others. It was one of those transitions you go through, the kind that makes you feel slightly out of place, unsure of where you belong. It wasn't that I didn't like the change, but the unfamiliarity left me with a sense of unease, like I was waiting for something to happen, something to click into place. I decided to take a walk that afternoon, hoping the stroll would calm my mind. I wasn't heading anywhere specific, just wandering, letting my feet carry me through the unfamiliar streets. As I walked, the day grew darker, the sky streaked with streaks of orange and pink, and I found myself on a narrow side street I hadn't noticed before. At the end of it, there was a little cafe tucked into the corner, the kind that didn't draw much attention but had an inviting charm about it. The windows were fogged up slightly from the inside, but the soft, warm glow from within made it look like the perfect place to rest for a while. The sign above the door simply read "Caf," with no grand branding or anything particularly unique about it. But something about it called to me. I pushed the door open, the bell above it chiming softly as I entered. It felt like the kind of place you could sink into, where time didn't matter. The atmosphere was warm, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air. I could hear the soft hum of quiet conversations and the clink of coffee cups against saucers. Everything felt like it was supposed to be there. I approached the counter and ordered a cappuccino, the kind I always ordered when I didn't want to think about what to choose. The barista nodded and started preparing my drink, a calm, easy smile on her face. I took a moment to look around, to take in the setting. The cafe wasn't large, just a few tables scattered throughout, each occupied by someone lost in their own thoughts or deep in conversation. There was a couple by the window, both laughing quietly, their heads close together. A man sat in the corner, absorbed in a book, while a group of friends chatted animatedly at a table near the back. There was nothing unusual about the scene. Everything seemed normal, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange sense of discomfort creeping up my spine. Maybe it was the quiet that hung in the air, or the way everyone seemed so absorbed in their own worlds, too absorbed. It felt almost too perfect, like a scene from a movie. My drink was ready, and I walked over to a small table in the corner. I sat down and took a sip, savoring the warmth as it slid down my throat. But as I looked around again, I started to notice something. The people, every person in the cafe were strangers. I had never seen them before in my life. They weren't familiar faces, not even faces I recognized from the street. I couldn't place any of them, and yet, there was this feeling, deep in my gut, that I had seen them somewhere before. I looked at the couple near the window, smiling at each other. Their faces seemed so familiar, like I had seen them across the room at another cafe or walked by them on the street, but I couldn't remember when or how. The man with the book in the corner, the way his brow furrowed as he turned the page felt strangely familiar to, and the group of friends, laughing and teasing each other, were all so comfortable with one another, so natural, yet their faces were foreign. I swallowed my unease, telling myself that it was just a new place, a new environment, and I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just in a different state of mind, missing the familiarity of my old life. But the more I tried to brush it off, the more uncomfortable I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong about this place. I looked at my phone, as if for some kind of grounding in reality. But the moment I checked the time, I froze. It was later than I thought, later than it should have been. The cafe had been open for only a short while when I walked in, and yet, hours had passed. It wasn't just that the time had shifted, was the way the room seemed to have changed with it. The lighting, the sounds, the entire atmosphere felt different now, darker somehow, as if the clock had turned forward into the evening when it hadn't even felt like it had begun. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, suddenly aware of the growing unease in my chest. I had to leave. I didn't know why, but I couldn't stay any longer. As I made my way toward the door, I passed the tables again, and I couldn't help but glance at the people sitting there. The couple was still by the window, but now their smiles seemed too wide, too perfect. Their eyes followed me as I passed, and the feeling of recognition intensified. The man with the book was no longer reading. He was watching me, too, with an expression that was impossible to decipher, but unsettling all the same. I reached the door, and just as I was about to push it open, something stopped me. The door wouldn't open. I tugged at the handle again, but it didn't budge. Panic flared in my chest as I pulled harder, but it was locked asterisk from the inside asterisk. I couldn't understand. It had been open when I entered, and now it wouldn't open. I could hear the soft chatter behind me, the clink of silverware, the laughter, but none of it felt right. It felt wrong, like I was trapped in a space I wasn't supposed to be in. I turned back around, scanning the room for someone, anyone, who might be able to help. But the faces staring back at me weren't just unfamiliar. They were empty asterisk. No one spoke, no one moved. They were all just looking at me, watching, as if they were waiting for me to realize something. And in that moment, I did. These people, this cafe, this place, it wasn't real. I don't know how I knew it, but I felt it, deep in my bones. None of them were real. None of it was real. It was all a facade, a carefully constructed lie, and I had walked right into it, as if drawn by some unseen force. I pulled at the door once more, this time with everything I had. The handle gave way, the door swung open, and I stumbled out into the street, breathing hard, my pulse racing. The street outside was empty. The sky had darkened, and a chill had settled in the air. But as I looked back at the cafe, I saw nothing. The building was gone. There was no sign of the little cafe, no sign that it had ever existed. The street was bare, as if nothing had ever been there at all. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain it. And now, every time I walk down that street, I still look for it, the cafe, the people. But it's never there. Just an empty block, the silence stretching out before me, like it was never meant to be found in the first place. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I first saw her. I was standing on the corner of a quiet street, waiting for the light to change so I could cross to the coffee shop I frequented every day. It was a peaceful part of the city, one that felt familiar, comfortable. The kind of place where nothing unexpected ever seemed to happen. The same people walked past every day, some in a rush, others taking their time, and there was always the low hum of distant conversations and car engines. I loved the routine of it all. But then, she appeared. She wasn't someone I recognized, and there was nothing particularly striking about her, just a woman in her late 20s, walking with purpose, dressed in a simple coat and jeans. She moved with confidence, her head held high, eyes focused straight ahead. What caught my attention, though, wasn't how she looked or even how she moved. It was the way she approached the building. It was an old office building, one of those structures with faded stonework and worn windows that had clearly seen better days. Most people passed it by, as there wasn't much that stood out about it. But as she walked toward it, something felt off. She didn't stop at the door, didn't reach for the handle like everyone else would. Instead, she simply walked into it. At first, I thought she was just entering like anyone would. But then, as she crossed the threshold, something strange happened. The door, which had been there just a moment ago, simply disappeared. It didn't swing shut, or creak as though it had been left ajar. It vanished completely, leaving no trace behind. One moment it was there, and the next it was as if the door had never existed. I stood there, stunned, my feet rooted to the spot. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd misremembered the layout of the building, or maybe the door had already been open and I hadn't noticed. But that didn't make sense. I knew that door had been there, the way it had always been, familiar and unchanging. And yet now, in its place, there was only a blank wall where the entrance should have been. My heart started to race, and I quickly glanced around, hoping to see someone else noticing what had just happened. But the street was as quiet as ever. No one seemed to have seen anything unusual, and the light had changed, urging me to cross. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started walking toward the building, not sure what I was going to do, but driven by some strange urge to figure out what had just occurred. As I approached, the wall stood cold and indifferent, its surface untouched, but the spot where the door had been was unmistakably empty. There was no sign of the woman, no shadow cast by her figure, nothing. It was as if she had never been there at all, as if she had melted into the building itself. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the stone. It was solid, no different from the rest of the building, and I could feel the faint dampness of the afternoon rain that had settled on the surface. The air around me was still, too still. No sounds of footsteps, no honking horns, just the distant murmur of the city. But the building, it didn't feel the same anymore. It felt wrong, like it was hiding something from me, something I couldn't quite grasp. I stepped back and looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. People continued to walk past, oblivious to the strange event that had just unfolded. I felt like an intruder, a witness to something I wasn't meant to understand. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I had imagined the whole thing. After all, the mind plays tricks when it's tired, right? But something deep inside me wouldn't let it go. I couldn't stop thinking about that door, how it had simply disappeared, how the woman had vanished without a trace, and how I couldn't find a single explanation for any of it. I made a decision then. I would go inside. I knew it was irrational, that there was no real reason to do so, but the thought consumed me. I had to know what was behind that wall, why the door had disappeared. So, I walked around the building, searching for another entrance, but there was none. The side doors were locked, and the back alley was as empty as the front. There was no sign of life anywhere. I even tried knocking on the building's exterior, as if I could somehow summon the door back into existence, but the stone remained silent, cold. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. The whole thing felt like a dream, like a strange, half-forgotten memory that was slipping through my fingers. I left the building that afternoon, but the unease didn't leave me. It clung to me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I walked home, but every step felt slower, heavier, as if the city itself had changed somehow, subtly and irrevocably. The next day, I couldn't resist going back. I wanted to know, I needed to know, if the building had somehow changed, if I had been mistaken, or if, for some reason, the door had simply been removed. But when I arrived, there was no building. The spot where it had stood the day before was now an empty lot, barren and overgrown with weeds. The streets around it were unchanged, the world moving along as if nothing had ever been there. I walked up and down the block, searching for any sign that the building had ever existed, but there was nothing. No remnants, no clues, just an empty space. I didn't know how to explain it, and still don't. Maybe it was a glitch in reality, some strange wrinkle in time or perception. Maybe it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks. But the longer I stood there, staring at the empty lot, the more I felt the weight of it, the sense that I had been on the edge of something far beyond understanding. The door, the woman, the building, none of it made sense. And yet, I couldn't forget it. I've returned to that spot many times since then, but the lot remains the same. Every time I look, the space feels as if it's waiting for something, waiting for me to come back. Maybe the door will appear again, or maybe it was never meant for me to find. But there's one thing I know for certain now. I'll never look away from that spot again. Because I have this feeling, the same unsettling feeling I had that day that if I do, the door might appear once more, and this time, I won't be able to walk away. It started with a simple, mundane task, cleaning out the basement. I had just moved into an old house, and while it wasn't falling apart, it certainly had the kind of wear you'd expect from a place that had been around for decades. The floors creaked in places, and the wallpaper was peeling at the edges, but there was something comforting about it. I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen, just a few hours of sorting through boxes and getting the space organized. The basement was a mix of old furniture, dusty boxers, and forgotten relics of the house's past tenants. It smelled musty, but not unpleasant. It was the kind of space that felt like it had stories to tell, if only the walls could speak. I was going through an old chest when I noticed something odd. A section of the floorboards in the corner seemed off. Not broken, not even out of place, but there was something slightly different about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edge of the boards. They felt colder than the rest of the room, and there was a small gap where the wood didn't quite meet. Curiosity got the best of me, so I pulled at the boards, expecting to find a small crawl space, or maybe just a piece of forgotten debris. But as the floorboards shifted, I saw it a narrow hole, about the width of a small doorway, descending into the darkness below. I hesitated, unsure of whether I should even consider going down. After all, what kind of house has hidden tunnels beneath it? It was probably some kind of old maintenance shaft, right? Or maybe a forgotten part of the house that had been walled off years ago. Still, a part of me wanted to know what lay beneath, and another part was already regretting the decision before I'd even made it. But the curiosity pulled me in. I grabbed a flashlight, turned it on, and carefully descended into the hole. The tunnel was narrow, just wide enough for me to crawl through comfortably, but it stretched far beyond what I could see from the opening. The walls were made of stone, rough and uneven, as though it had been dug out by hand, the stones jagged and cold to the touch. I tried to steady my breath, unsure if I was more excited or nervous about what I might find. As I moved deeper into the tunnel, the air grew cooler, heavier, as if the earth itself was pressing in around me. The walls seemed to close in, and with each step, the tunnel felt less like a forgotten passage and more like something deliberate. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the narrow space, amplifying the silence that surrounded me. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak or groan from the house above, but it was distant, faint and muffled, like the house was far away instead of just a few feet above. I kept moving, unsure how far I'd gone, but the tunnel seemed endless. There were no signs, no markers, just the steady feeling that I was being led somewhere. I felt like I was drifting away from my house, from everything familiar. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel suddenly opened up, revealing a small, low-ceilinged chamber. The air here was heavier still, almost oppressive, and the darkness seemed to settle deeper around me. I stood in the center of the room, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand, illuminating the walls. And then I noticed it. In the far corner of the chamber was a small door, wooden, old, with a tarnished brass handle. It was unlike anything I'd seen before in the house, and it made my skin prickle with unease. The door didn't belong here, not in this hidden room under my house. It was too out of place. My heart raced, but I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. The air felt heavier with each step, and the distant hum that had started earlier now seemed louder, more insistent. It wasn't a sound I could place, but it was there, vibrating in the air like an old machine left running too long. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling, and as soon as I touched it, the hum stopped. I pulled the door open slowly. It creaked on its hinges, the sound scraping through the stillness of the room. What I found on the other side wasn't what I expected. The tunnel beyond the door didn't lead deeper into the earth, as I had assumed. It wasn't some kind of forgotten sewer or maintenance shaft. No, this was something else entirely. The walls of this tunnel were smooth, clean, and perfectly constructed, nothing like the jagged hand-dug passage I had just come through. It was like a passage from an entirely different world. The air here was different, too fresher, but somehow heavier, as though I had stepped into a place that didn't belong to me. I stepped into the tunnel, compelled by something I couldn't explain. My heart was pounding now, my thoughts a jumble of fear and disbelief. The tunnel twisted, bending in ways that didn't make sense. It didn't feel like it was under my house anymore. It didn't even feel like it was under my street. As I walked, the atmosphere grew thicker, almost suffocating, and a faint whispering began to fill the space around me. It wasn't words, just an indistinct murmur that seemed to come from all directions. But it was unsettling, like the tunnel itself was speaking. And then, after what felt like hours of walking through this endless, unnatural tunnel, I saw something in the distance. A faint light. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I drew closer, the light grew brighter, more distinct. It was coming from an opening at the end of the tunnel. I reached the opening and stepped into the light. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. I was standing in the middle of a street, but it wasn't the street outside my house. It wasn't even close. The houses here were different, older, more worn down, and the street itself seemed to have a history I couldn't place. There was no one around, no cars, no people, just an eerie stillness that filled the air. The streetlights flickered dimly, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked pavement. I turned around, hoping to see the tunnel behind me, to turn back, but there was no tunnel. Just a street. Just a neighborhood I didn't recognize. A place I had never been. I didn't know how I got here. I didn't know how the tunnel had led me to this strange, forgotten part of the city. I couldn't even find my way back to the house I had come from. I wandered through the streets, but everything felt wrong. Like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, and I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. The longer I stayed, the more disoriented I became. I tried retracing my steps, looking for anything familiar, but there was nothing. No landmarks, no signs of life. Just the strange, empty streets stretching endlessly in all directions. I never found my way back to the tunnel. It's as if it vanished entirely, swallowed by the earth, leaving no trace of its existence. I've been back to the house several times, but the tunnel is gone. No matter how much I search, no matter how much I look, there's no sign of it beneath the floorboards. I'm not sure what happened that day. Maybe it was a dream, Or maybe I wandered into a place that wasn't meant for me. But I can't shake the feeling that the neighborhood I found isn't real, that it's waiting for me to return.